Hello, everyone. This is your host, Andrew Pledger, and I am a survivor of Bob Jones University. And this is Beyond BJU Exposing Fundamentalism, which is a podcast that sheds light on Christian fundamentalism in the context of Bob Jones University. The show includes survivor stories from BJU and also Bob Jones affiliated ministries like Christian day schools, camps, and churches. The podcast also explores BJU's influence beyond the school and its impact on American society. I want to thank my Patreon supporters who allow me to do this work, and if you could join my Patreon, it would be greatly appreciated. The link is in the description of every episode. But if you feel that you can't do that, then I would appreciate it if you would leave a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because this helps other listeners like you discover the show. Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is Andrew Pledger, and this is part 3 of Exposing the Wilds. And before we get into the third interview with Tabitha, I really wanted to do an intro about this episode, kind of an overview to know what we're going to be talking about. So, this part continues to bring to light the disturbing realities within the wilds, a Christian camp associated with Bob Jones University. Through the testimony of Tabitha Frady, the episode divulges the camp's inadequate handling of sexual abuse reports, favoring biblical counseling over professional help, and is advocacy for forced forgiveness and victim shaming. The discussion extends to exploitation and unjust treatment of staff, including a missionary family that lived on a nearby property by the wilds. And furthermore, the episode also highlights severe injuries and deaths resulting from the camp's negligence and the challenges faced by individuals adjusting to life after leaving such a restrictive environment. The episode also digs into the wild's pervasive influence and its global outreach through the Camps Abroad program. So that's what we will be digging into in this episode, but let's get into the third part of Exposing the Wilds. Hello, everyone. This is the next part of really the Wilds series with Tabitha Frady. And throughout this series, she's brought us through her upbringing at Bethany Baptist at Brevard and the experiences at that church and that school. And then she has really shared a lot about her experiences and what she saw at the Wilds Christian camp. And she's back to continue sharing her experiences and stories from the Wild Christian camp. And I think in the last episode, we ended really talking about the teen camp, and she wants to come back on and share other stories and also just talk about the other different camps that they have. But thank you so much, Tabitha, for coming back on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me back round 3, which is pretty cool. But yeah, I just feel like there's so much that we haven't even scratched the surface with. And like Andrew's been saying, hopefully this prompts other people who've had these experiences to come forward and share what their experiences were like at the wilds, because there's a lot. There's a lot that they've hidden. There's a lot that they don't talk about, and they're just not featured anywhere. Nobody's talking about them. So I'm really hoping that me sharing this will give other people courage to stand up and put a stop to some of the stuff that they're doing.
Yeah, most definitely. And thank you so much for standing up. And I was saying to you earlier that it's always hard to be that first person to do it, like when you don't see anyone else talking about. But once you do it, which is hard, then there are a bunch of other survivors and people who will be supporting you when you deal with the backlash from speaking out about these issues. But I know a story you have wanted to get into was sadly you counseling or being in charge of a camper who experienced sexual abuse. And I know in a previous episode, you had talked about like how that's handled at the Wild, and it's just absolutely horrible. But whatever you are comfortable sharing about this experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, like I'm not going to share names or anything like that, but I did have a camper who had come forward to me about an uncle that had been abusing her and had been very ashamed of it. And she felt comfortable sharing this with me, which really hurt me because legally I'm required to act as an adult. But my preference for acting would have been to not let her go home where this perpetrator still existed in her life and speaking to law enforcement with her, getting her some counseling from people who are trained in sexual abuse of minors. That was what I would have preferred to do. And I obviously did not want to break her trust either because it is her decision to come forward about that. At least in my mind, that's how I felt about it. Unfortunately, the Wilds does not agree with any of that. So all counseling is done by full-time staff members who most of them don't have any kind of counseling degrees. Or if they do have a counseling degree, it's biblical counseling from Bob Jones, which we all know how useful that is. So it was really hard to talk to her, and I cried with her and her lost innocence. And I filled out the form that the Wilds gives out to report sexual abuse with her knowledge and her being there with me. And then I had to turn it into my lead counselor. Now, I had never personally had a camper that had expressed sexual abuse before. So I wasn't really sure what happened after I turned it into my lead counselor. The good person in me thought that they would take it to law enforcement or meet with her, but instead they told me not to worry about it anymore, that they would handle it. And I asked if I should come with her because they were like, we want to set up a time to meet with her. And I asked if I should come with her, and they said, no, we want to talk to her alone. And I was uncomfortable with that because, again, I felt like it was her choice on whether she wanted to speak to them or not, but they didn't seem to feel that way. So they basically arranged a meeting during free time when we're all supposed to be out having fun and told me to have her at this place. So I took her there, expecting just my lead counselor and me to sit down and talk with her about next steps. And instead, they had a full-time staff lady there that they had already shared all the details with. And she had her Bible and her tree and her counseling notebook. And she informed us that we could leave and that she would stay with this girl. This girl was really uncomfortable with that. And I felt really not okay with it. And I asked if I could stay, and they told me no. I just left and I told her I would be right outside. And if she needed me, she could come get me. And I just sat there waiting for her. I don't know a lot about what they said. I know I talked a little bit about how they feel like they handle those situations with you need to forgive this person and you need to call them and forgive them because God would forgive them. And I know she came back out and she was like completely shell shocked, wouldn't talk to me anymore, wouldn't look at me, just was crying. She said that they were going to call her parents and tell her parents what had happened, and that they were telling her they'd already told her youth leader what had happened. And it was like this chain domino effect reaction of all these people they told about this really private thing that started out just between me and her. And that still really bothers me a lot because I just felt when somebody goes through abuse that it's really hard to even find the courage to say something about it because there's so much shame wrapped around it, especially in the IFB movement. It's never the man's problem. It was like, what were you wearing? And what did you do? And why didn't you tell somebody? If you didn't tell anybody, then maybe it didn't actually happen. And Why didn't you do whatever? I know that they pushed her really hard to forgive her perpetrator, which she did tell me. And I know they showed her like some verses on forgiveness and God forgiving people and how she should forgive people, which is just not helpful in those situations. And they didn't really seem to let her process it at all. And then they just immediately went and told other people. But they didn't report it to the police, which is the one person they actually probably should have told. But they just didn't even do that. So after those reports are done, I have no idea what happens to them. I never saw a law enforcement officer on the campsite, ever. And I know that there were multiple campers that reported sexual abuse, but they seemed content to let the youth leaders handle it, and they would just give the forms to the youth leaders. At the end of the week, her form just went with her youth leader, who said that he was going to follow up with her parents. In all reality, probably nothing ever happened to that man. He probably got away with it, but it's just horrible. That was like one of the experiences of a camper with sexual abuse that I personally had. And it really turned me off from counseling or even reporting anything because they make you feel guilty. They're like, you have to report this. What if you don't report it? And then you're lying. And then what if something happens to them? So they make you feel like you have to report it, but then they don't actually do anything of value with it other than shame these people or question them about why this happened and like details. And it's so bad. So that was my experience with it.
Yeah, my just it's just yeah, it's terrible. My heart just like hurts so much just hearing that story because she went through so much more unnecessary re-traumatization from that. And this is an example of what just why biblical counseling is so harmful because it's shame-based. It's shame-based. It's what's wrong with you when this little girl, like, oh my gosh, like it's just so crazy to me to think that someone has to jump to, you have to forgive. And it's like she's traumatized. She's literally has trauma just locked like in her mind, in her body that will probably affect her the rest of her life. That will maybe lessen. I don't know if she's gotten help or not, but like most likely it's a lifelong thing. And it's just it's that magical thinking. It's that magical thinking as part of it in that environment of we have the solution. You just have to do this. And just honestly, fuck the tree. Fuck the tree. Oh my
Well,
God.
that's the whole thing is they root it back to bitterness. And they're like, if you can't forgive, then you're bitter in your heart. And bitterness is the enemy of God. And if you're bitter, then you can't let anything good inside of you. And then not only has your abuser physically, but now they've taken your heart away from God too. And you're going to lose your faith because of it and your salvation because you can't forgive this horrible person. There were messages preached on that by Rand Hummel, Tom Farrell. Some of the big names were really big on forgiving people that had hurt you.
This is a place where I wanted to add Rand Hummel's infamous sermon on telling a girl to forgive her abusers. And I had this sermon in the Grace Report episode because it's mentioned in the Grace Report because he did this sermon example at Bob Jones and also at the Wilds. And I think it's important for you to hear it. But if you want to skip it, it's 3 minutes long, just to let you know. But here is the sermon.
The girl responded and went to the counseling room. She was weeping and weeping, and the sponsor came and said, "Can you help us?" I said, "Well, tell me a little bit about it." I said, "Well, we don't know her well. She's only been in our school a couple months. She's very intelligent, but she never smiles, and she doesn't have any friends." I went back and sat across. She continued to weep the longest time. And finally, she looked up at me. She said, "God hates me." I said, "Young lady, life is not fair," and it's not. But God's love never changes. Why do you think God hates you? She said, if God loved me, all these terrible things would never happen in my life. I don't even know who my real parents are. They dumped me off at an orphanage. My mom and dad that adopted me. When I was 9, they started fighting and they got a divorce. Mom got married again when I was 11. From the time I was 13 to 15, my stepdad took physical liberties with me. Mom found out and divorced him. God hates me. I said, young lady, you've lived a very difficult life, a very hard life. But let's look at your sin in this situation. When I said that, she lost it. She said, my sin, it wasn't me. My mom, my dad, my stepdad. I said, yeah, you've allowed this sin of these folks to create such anger and hatred and bitterness in your heart. I took her to Hebrews 12, where you got to look diligently, and some of you need to do that. If you're bitter, you're angry, it's not God's fault, okay? He offered the grace to get you through this. We failed the grace of God. Then it says, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you. She didn't have any friends. And many be defiled. You know, she never could smile. Finally, God broke her heart, and she got on her knees and asked God to forgive her. When she got off her knees, I said, that's the first part in handling this bitterness and anger. Now you need to go home and ask your mom, and your dad, and your stepdad forgiveness for your hatred towards them. She said, Rand, I can't. I said, you've got to. You exercise yourself in the book of Acts to have a conscience void, empty of offense between God and men. You come to worship God and you have aught or anything against them, you leave your gift, go make it right with them, then come back and worship God. It's so important. In fact, if you're not right with mom and dad, you can't be right with God. Do you understand that? Finally, she said, I can't do it, and left camp. I got a letter from her, she said, all the way home. Couldn't get out of my mind. Finally decided, no, it's too hard. I can't deal with this. She said, when I got to the school, I couldn't believe it. My dad was visiting there to pick me up. And all the way to the house in his truck, I couldn't even talk. And finally he said, what's wrong? And I started to cry. And then I asked him to forgive me for being so angry with him because he left me when I was 9. She said, I went in and made things right with my mom and called my stepdad. Gang, I'll never forget what she wrote at the bottom of that letter. She said, finally, for the first time in my teenage life, I can smile.
I heard that sermon in person. And as I mentioned, like in the teen camp and the JVC, we were forced to study his 6-week Bible studies on whatever. And one of them really did talk a lot about bitterness and forgiving. I think it was his study on James. And we had to like study that and talk to people about what are you holding in your heart that you need to let go of so you can be forgiven.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so like another thing that like is horrible, and because I'm like trying to understand, I'm like, can these people not have the compassion to understand that this horrific abuse, so these people don't have any training in trauma at all? Can they not even, are they so narcissistic that they cannot understand, at least on some level, comprehend how horrible something like this is? And one thing I've really realized as I've gotten out is that they have this black and white view of free will. All your thoughts and emotions are 100% in your control, which I don't agree with that take at all, to a certain extent, but it's just there's so many things that are locked in our unconscious. A lot of the things that we do for them, once you start to let go of, that threatens their whole worldview and their thing, so that they have to make this fit. And it's absolutely horrible, the abuse and harm that happens from it. But anyways, so it's a horrible situation. And oh my gosh, I hope that girl is okay now.
Me too. I never spoke to her again. Like I said, after that, she pretty much shut me out. And I'm sure she blamed me for having to go through that. And I felt horrible because, again, that wasn't my intention for her to go through that. My intention was for her to bring this to justice. So it's just horrible that kind of stuff happens. And even then, when I was fully drinking the Kool-Aid at that point, and I still thought that it was so wrong of them to be like, first thing, you need to forgive this person, because it allows no time for grief or healing or processing. And that's something about the IFB movement that even when I look back in like some of my journals when I was journaling was so painful, was that they get you so indoctrinated into you can't ever have a bad day. You can't ever be sad about something. You can't ever feel any negative emotions because the tree says that you're now doubting who God's character is. So you're so afraid to not just be like fine all the time, to the point where people would be like, "So how are you doing?" And you're just like, "I'm fine. I'm good. Everything's good." And you could have the worst day of your life. You could have just found out all of your family was killed and you still have to be just fine and good. And then even the prayers that reflect that, of if it's God's will, and Lord, we know this is your will, and it was a horrible tragedy, but we know it's your will. And it's just so callous because there's no, again, time to grieve or be upset. I remember when one of the girls in my cabin was part of Colonial Hills Baptist Church in Indianapolis, which has its own scandalous history. But her youth pastor was driving their bus back to Indiana, and they flipped the bus. It was all over the news. And him and his wife, who was pregnant, were both killed. And several of the kids were injured. And they were like 5 miles away from home. And actually, some of the people that I personally knew from the wilds ended up going to that church and taking over the youth ministry there. And then several more people went up and joined them and became like assistant pastors there. So it's like when they left the wilds, a whole group of people moved up to that church in Indianapolis. So it was really interesting. But when they prayed over that, I knew one of the girls that was on that bus that had been in my cabin when I was a camper. And I didn't even know if she was alive or if she was okay. I had no idea. And I didn't know her well. We spent a week together, but still, as a teenager, that's so shocking. And all of the prayers that we prayed or that people prayed around me were, Lord, we know this was your will and you want to use it for a greater good. And it just is horrible. These people just died, and we're like, it's for a greater good, and use their deaths as a ministry. And it's just the idea that you can't have any sad feelings or be like upset about something and you have to think of it as God's greater good is just, it's,
Yeah, yeah, I know. I remember something similar to just when my paternal grandfather had died, and my grandmother just immediately, it was like not allowed to grieve. She just went to, oh, it was God's will. It was God had the right time for him. And I'm just like, you can grieve, like that's okay. But it's just spiritual bypassing is so common in that environment to just not deal with those deeper issues.
yeah. Which actually leads me to an interesting thing about the wilds is that they don't really, and IFB movement in general, promote men being single for long. So when I was growing up at Bethany, I knew Matt Herbster, who was the director of the Wilds for a while, and his wife got cancer and she died. 6 months later, he remarried one of the younger college and career women at the church. And basically, when his wife Julie was dying, she supposedly told a mutual friend of theirs that she had handpicked this woman to be the mother of her children after she died. And it was fast. She died in March. They were talking in May. And this was his high school sweetheart. They'd been married like 20 years. And we all knew it. And nobody talked about it. They were talking and they were dating and they were allowed to go out and be alone together sometimes, which was really weird because obviously we as like staff members were not allowed to do that. And then she was just expected to fill this woman's role for his 4 children and the camp where Julie had led like a lot of the women's ministry. And I remember he married her in January or February, so not even a year after his wife had died, he married her. And I remember that summer they did some songs and stuff talking about how Julia died, but Tiffany had been brought into his life. And he kept talking about Julie as his wife, and Tiffany was just Tiffany. He never said, my wife, Tiffany. He would say, my wife, Julie, died of cancer this year, and God brought Tiffany into my life, but never referred to her as his wife or anything. It was so awkward and embarrassing. And again, it's the same thing where you're not allowed to grieve. This was his high school sweetheart. You would think that you wouldn't be able to just completely move on, have a new wife in less than a year after she had died. I personally don't think I could have moved on that fast. Now, I don't know. Thankfully, I've never been in that situation, but I just can't imagine that you could move on that fast. Not to mention the psychological piece for their kids who just lost their mom and now they have a new mom. And that's a theme in IFB movements. When the father loses his wife, they find an eligible single woman in the church to push towards them to get married. And I think that's what you were talking about, where you just don't have an opportunity to grieve like a normal person or heal like a normal person. And you're just expected to be like, this is God's will, so I'm going to move on with this woman. And it can create some really harmful things for the children involved and things like that.
Yeah, I had no idea about that story. So I was like, wow, I was just like, that is insane. And it makes me think of Bob Jones III when he remarried so quickly. When that happened at Bob Jones, I was like, okay, all right.
It's weird. It's like they can't be single. The lust of the flesh is going to push them to do something wrong. I don't know.
I
Like,
know what you mean. I wondered that
that's
too,
their
because it's just sad. It's, oh, let me get my new sex doll to make me not fall. And it's sad. I know that's a horrible way to put it, but it's just women are objectified in that environment so much.
and they were expected to be like the homemakers and take care of the children and homeschool all of them because you can't put those kids in a real school. People are going to figure out really quick how messed up this place is. So it was just, she was expected to step in, having never been married before, and raise these four kids and be the perfect helpmeet. And I hate that they call it that, the helpmeet for the man. You're not a team, you're not equals. He's the leader of the household and she's the helpmeet for him. And just how quickly everyone just accepted it too and was like, just fine. Julie had never been there. That was crazy to me. And even like them talking to him like right after she had died about Tiffany being an option, like within a month.
Wow.
So if I had just buried my wife from cancer, I don't think that honestly, as a human being, you are healed enough in a month's time to be like out there dating a new person. That's just me.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Yeah, no, that is one of the strange things one of many strange things of that world. But yeah, I know there were some other things about the wilds you want to discuss, and one of them was the junior.
Yes. So now that we've gotten through how they handle abuse and death and all of that stuff, junior boot camp was like a sub camp. So basically, you could start going to camp from the time you were 8 years old, which is wild. I don't know many parents that let their kids like sleep over anymore. And I know I just said wild again. I know it's hard to not say that because it really is a crazy place, but they would let kids start coming to overnight week-long camp at the age of 8 years old. And that camp was 8 to 12-year-olds, which is a very large difference in age group. They would try and pair them from 8 to 10 and then 10 to 12. So you didn't have an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old in the same room. But I don't know how much that often worked. So when I was there, every counselor had to do 2 weeks in JBC. And so if there's a 10-week camp, you did 2 weeks in JBC and then you did 8 weeks in teen camp. And everyone, for the most part, hated JBC because you have these 8-year-olds who have never been away from home before, bawling every night, which is just uncomfortable. You had some that still wet the bed, and you had ones that were on all these medications. And then the parents would send them with $40. And the only thing for them to buy was candy. So they would stuff themselves with candy and they'd throw up every first night. So many kids were throwing up. It was wild. In teen camp, we talked a little bit about how they were housed, which was the girls had these cabins and that had air conditioning, and the boys had this like cabin that wasn't air conditioned. JBC was worse for everybody. It was a 4-story dormitory that was shared with the sewer. So literally the sewer is to the right, out the window. You can see it, you can smell it. They called it the chocolate factory for these kids because you could see everything and you could smell it. And it was musty and moldy. Every single counselor would walk out of there sick by the end of the week because it was just not a good place to live. You could not live there. If someone had come and had examined this, I don't think that they would have passed because it was horrible. And the bunk beds were metal bunk beds with a mattress that was about 6 inches thick. They used to keep all of those mattresses above a barn, above the landscaping shed. And then one of the jobs on May staff, which was the prep group 2 weeks before camp, was to bleach all of these mattresses before we put them in the dorms because they were covered in mold. So you had to bleach them and then put them into the cabins. And I did May staff too, which was the 2-week prep thing. We did the craziest stuff on May staff. I had to wipe down all of the bathroom walls. I also had to go to the garbage and open all of the garbage bags and pull the recyclables out. There were maggots, there were worms, there was flies, there's disgusting tampons. Doesn't matter. You're in the dump digging through these bags, getting recyclables out, which was insane. It was insane. So that was one of the jobs of May staff, was to bleach all of those mattresses. When you had JBCers, their headquarters, this has all changed, but they ended up shutting down the dormitory and building campsites closer to the JBC, but probably because it was unsafe to live there. But you had to go up this giant hill on the road with turns to get your campers and walk them down this road every day. So you had to go up there to the GHQ. It was called General Headquarters. Surprise, junior boot camp was themed after military. So you have a bunch of 8 and 12-year-olds who are like basically being militarized. And so we had to go up to get them. You were either the red team or the blue team. Boys and girls were in the same dormitory, but on separate floors. So the boys' floor was on the first floor, and the girls' floor was on the top floor. And they made this huge thing about how the boys were never to go up the stairs past that point, and the doors were locked every night. The doors were locked every night. Locked. You have a bunch of 8-year-olds. You locked them in with adults that they've never met before. If somebody got sick, you had to go to the lead counselor for JBC's room, knock on it, and get them to unlock the door so you could hike this child up the hill to the nurse's station. So there was just like so much that was wrong in this situation. But you would go up to GHQ, General Headquarters, to get these kids. And of course, their parents are there and they're crying because they don't actually want to be there. But their parents are like, oh, it'll be fun for you and you'll make friends and stuff. So you could get your campers. Once you got them all, you had to walk them down the hill with the road while all these cars and buses are coming in to check in. So you have to try and wrangle all of these 8 to 12-year-olds to get them down the hill. And they're crying and they're complaining because it's hot and they're tired and they're leaving their parents. And then you have to get their bags and take them up to the dorm. And then basically they were like, don't let them really say a long goodbye to their parents. Get them in there as quickly as possible. So you like take them in there, you put them in their bunks, And then they would give you like medical sheets about each of the JBCers. They wouldn't always do that for the teen campers, but for the JBCers, they would give you a medical sheet if they had any dietary restrictions or if they like were allergic to anything. And then you had to take their money. You took all of their money and you put it in these envelopes and they could take it out once a day. Now, I was probably a little stricter than some of the other counselors because I didn't want them to throw up all night the first night. So I would only let them take out like a little bit of money, and I said no candy after 6 o'clock because I'm a good person and I didn't want them to throw up everywhere.
Yes, you were. That was a good decision.
But I
Yeah.
got in a lot of trouble for it from the leadership because they were like, how dare you tell them that seems harsh. Like, why aren't you letting them have fun? I was like,
Wait, I'm sorry. What? The leaders who put all these kids through hell like
yeah.
weekly are, oh my God, you won't let them have candy after 6? Oh my
I mean, that's
God.
like a very long window. I gave them lots of time to have candy. But the thing is, like in teen camp, you're playing these high energy games. Nobody's allowed to sit out. They all have to run and push balls and throw stuff. And if you've just eaten your weight in candy, then you're going to throw up. That's just science. So I wouldn't let them eat a bunch of candy before the game because I wanted them to have fun during the game and not be so sick to their stomachs. Because then that leads to a whole other host of problems. Dehydration, because these are 8-year-olds. Do you think they're drinking water? No, they're drinking soda. I actually had a rule that at every meal they had to drink 1 glass of water before they could drink anything else. Because again, they aren't hydrating. They're 8 and they don't know better. And the leaders were really mad at me about it. And I was like, they're 8. Their mom doesn't let them just drink soda all day. At least I hope not. And she's not letting them eat their weight in candy and ice cream because that's all they can afford to buy with this $40 they have. I'm not trying to be mean, but I'm trying to let them have the best experience that they can have. And they were like, we felt like you should have just let them do stuff that they wanted to do. And I actually got called into the office and reprimanded for this. And I was like, okay, whatever. The other thing about JBC that really sucked was that the bathrooms were communal. You didn't have a bathroom in each dorm room. They were in the middle of the hall. And the campers weren't allowed to go to the bathroom without letting you know. In the middle of the night, if one of them woke up and you had to go to the bathroom, you had to go stand out in the hall with them while they went to the bathroom and came back. But here's the bad part. There were showers in there. And in the teen rooms, you had 2 showers for 8 girls. In JBC, you had, I'm trying to count, 8 to 10 showers for 200 girls. So everyone only got 5 minutes to shower a piece. They literally had counselors in there that would beat on the curtains and tell them to get out of the shower. These very impressionable 8 to 12-year-old middle schoolers and be like, you have to get out now. You have to get out now and keep the line moving. They also were not allowed to go down to the bathroom fully clothed. They had to wear their towels and just bring their clothes with them and their soap and stuff. So you can imagine how that is. Get undressed, go
Mm.
down there and shower. It was so bad that some of the kids didn't want to shower. I actually would bring my campers back during part of their free time so that they could shower in peace. Again, this made me a monster, but I was trying to help them. And I remember like there's nowhere to change as a counselor because there's only like 3 to 4 bathroom stalls and all of them are filled with campers and all these showers are filled with campers. So you had to change super quick in your dorm room while they're gone showering. And I remember one time that I had like a blanket fort up here and I quickly slipped a shirt over my head and one of the girls walked in. I had a sports bra on and I slipped a shirt over my head, and apparently she told her mom that she saw me naked. which never happened.
Oh my God.
And I was like, I'm trying so hard to maintain whatever decency. I would hold blankets and stuff up for them so they could change. And she said that she saw my stomach or something. And leadership called me in again and was like, how dare you, basically. And I was like, what? I was fully clothed. It's fully clothed. I just slipped a shirt over my head. She saw a bit of my side. That's it. And that's all I had. I had 4 minutes to change because there's nowhere to change. And they're like, why didn't you change in the bathroom? I'm like, because the bathroom is full of people. There are so many kids there. They're all trying to use the bathroom. They're all trying to get in the shower. There isn't a shower available or a bathroom. What did you want me to do? Like, just wear the same clothes to the service? That wouldn't be okay because it wasn't a skirt. So it was just this whole thing. And the same thing, if they came without skirts or dresses, you had to go to the lead counselor cabin and get the lost and found skirts, which were like from the 80s and just hideous. And these kids are like crying. And the first night was always the worst. They would just cry and cry and cry. And it was horrible. That was like how that was set up. And you would do that for 2 weeks. And then you're sleeping by the sewer. It smells bad. Everyone's sick because there's so much mold in the place. They had carpet on the floor that had never been changed since like the campus started. It was so dingy and dark and horrible. And these poor girls, and I just remember them all like they had a good time, but I don't know that any of them like would come back. They had a very high turnover rate, if that's such a thing. There wasn't many people that came to JBC every year because it was so bad. And then of course all the songs are about being soldiers in Christ and marching and we are Christian soldiers, like that whole thing. And then the sermons were all very scary for 8 to 12-year-olds about hell and getting saved. And it's just like they're fucking 8.
That's when they want to get them. That's
Yeah,
what they want.
scaring them to death. They were terrified. I had girls like sobbing next to me, and I was just like, oh my God. And then every morning you would get up really early. JBC 8 first shift. So you had to be up at 6 in the morning after keeping these 8 to 10-year-olds out until 10 o'clock at night. And then, of course, they've all been stuffing their faces with sugar. They're not eating well. They're tired. You drag them all they have to make their beds, all that stuff. Then you have to drag them to breakfast and then scripture memory. And the schedule was very similar. Like you had scripture memory. It was just more controlled. You had chapel. You didn't have as much free time. Their free time really consisted of like the obstacle course and the craft shop. And the thing about the craft shop is that they sold these wooden guns with ping pong balls. 8 to 12-year-old boys loved that shit. And they would shoot all of the girls as they're going upstairs with these ping pong balls. And the guy counselors are like participating because they think it's funny. And the girls are like, and they're like hitting people's eyes. And it's just, where's the sense? And then you could go tubing with them. And then there was the lake. But again, you're at the lake with 8 to 12-year-olds. And it's a lake. And it's very scary to try and keep track of all of them. And going down the water slides and all of this stuff. It was so scary trying to keep track of that many children because these are kids, like teenagers, they're self-sufficient. You don't really have to worry too much about one of them like drowning most of the time. But like these kids, like they're just pushing each other in, jumping, swimming, and then they're dragged on this waterfall hike and none of them wanted to go because they're tired. And it was a lot. So JBC was like the same schedule as teen camp, but for younger kids. And the dorm was just the most appalling thing about it. And having to walk them on the road every day. That was crazy. I was like, why are we doing this? Cars came flying down that hill. And you just had to hope your camper stayed by the white line where they were supposed to.
Oh my gosh. Just the very like overt indoctrination techniques again throughout all of this. Like it's just I would say wild. It's
It is though.
it is wild. People are getting annoyed at this point. They're like, quit saying wild
It's
now.
gonna end
Stop
up
it.
on TikTok like wild, like just over and over again. I'm telling you, but it's a crazy place. Like the things that they were doing. If you went to somebody just out in the world and said, "Hey, I want to take 8-year-olds and put them in a hotel by a sewer with metal bunk beds and communal showers. Are you cool with that?" They would be like, "Absolutely not. You're not taking my child anywhere." But we did that all the time.
And I know some other things you want to talk about. I know the CA program. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, sure. So I did May staff, I did teen camp, I did JVC, I've worked op staff. So the next logical step was to become a CA, which was initially called 9-month staff, and they worked the off season. But then it changed to CA, which was camp apprentice. And basically, they were teaching people how to be set up for camp ministry. They wanted to teach these college age kids how to become ready to take on camp ministry. And at the time, I really loved camp. I liked what I was doing. I was again fully into the sauce here. And I had always wanted to do the CA program because I was friends with most of the 9-month staff all the other years because I was in the college and career group. And so they were also in the college and career group. And I was the only town person that would make an effort to come out to the events and stuff because they always scheduled it around the camp schedule. I would make this big attempt to come out there. And so I applied. And again, the first time I applied, Tim Meals was the director. And he came up to me and said that he turned me down because he wanted me to counsel first. Okay, fine. So I counseled first. So after I counseled, I put in my application and it was denied again. And I had done everything. I had done every job on this campsite. There was not a more qualified camp apprentice than me because I had done all of it. I worked my butt off on May staff. I was a supervisor during May staff, so I led my own team to do some of these jobs. And everyone was like, "You're definitely getting it." All of the full-time staff loved me. And they're like, "You're definitely going to get in. I don't understand like why you wouldn't," and whatever. So Tim Meals, I got a denied letter. And I was like, "Okay, let's talk about it." So I went to meet with him and he was like, "So the reason I denied you is because of your family." And I said, "What are you talking about? What do you mean?" And he's like, "Your family, they aren't exactly what we're looking for this ministry. Your mom can be very outspoken and your dad isn't super faithful in church. So we've decided that you're not what we're looking for this group." Which is just crazy that the reason I was denied was because of my family's background. And I was like shocked. And I was like, "You're telling me that the only reason I did everything you asked, the only reason that you're denying me is because of my family? They're not second generation Christians?" And he was like, "That is correct." I was like, "Okay." And I walked away. I remember telling one of the people that I was close to there about it. And same thing, you're not allowed to be sad about anything. She was like, "It's just God's will that this doesn't happen for you." And I was like, "What? Like, why would it not happen for me? I've done everything that they've ever asked me to do." And it's just because I was willing to question beliefs, because I did. I would question like why we were doing things. Remember, I'd been pulled in by leadership for the way I did some stuff. And so there was that. And then my family and Tim Meals specifically did not have a good relationship because Tim Meals ran the children's program at the church. And my mom believed in letting kids have personalities. And he was very against that and ended up having her removed from the children's program because of it and put a wild person in her place after she did that 3 to 5 year old ministry for 10 years. That was just him. He was like that. And you know what's so funny is he called that CA program reaping. So like the people that they got from it, He called them the A team. He said, this is literally, if I could hand pick a team, this would be my A team. And they were a disaster. So all of the guys would scream at each other in the like halls and stuff because they disagreed about how to put chairs out. The girls were very dysfunctional, but they were all that meek and quiet spirit. But they would get sick or cry a lot, and he didn't know how to handle that. One of the CAs was considered the golden child of the wilds, and his name was David Haynes, and he was like the head lifeguard and like all this stuff. And he ended up running away 3 months into it because he expressed that he was unhappy, and they forced him into counseling with Ken Collier to adjust his attitude. And one night he wrote a letter and he disappeared. His bag was packed. He didn't tell anybody he was leaving, and he just left. And they ended up sending an email out to everyone telling them that he had left and how they needed to pray for him because he was a wayward soul and he was following the sins of the flesh and was basically a reprobate, and how they needed to like pray for his soul.
So one thing I want to notice, this is like smearing and it's them controlling the narrative. I don't know what happened, but I'm sure he had something on them and they did something wrong and they wanted to protect their reputation and control the narrative. And so to silence him and to turn everyone against him. So it's typical cult tactic type.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
100%. He just disappeared. And they did that a lot with other people too. Like one of their staff kids got caught kissing her boyfriend at Bob Jones, and she had to apologize publicly to the church before she was accepted back into Bob Jones. And then her family sent an email out to every single church member asking them to not talk to her about why she'd been sent home, that she was there to learn and grow and find forgiveness, basically. And it was just, yeah, it was really cringy. And they did that anytime somebody left without any explanation. They would send this email out like, oh, don't talk to them. We need to pray for their soul, all of that stuff. It was really cringy. So that happened. So it was funny to watch his A team like fall apart in front of his face. But I guess I should thank him because if I had joined that program, who knows where I would be now. But that was the start of me leaving the wilds because I realized how fake it all was. Because this was his A team and they were horrible people. They did horrible things to me. They did horrible things to other people. That's when I started to leave the church, was when I explained in the episode about Bethany about how I left the church and wanted to go to a different church. And it was during this time frame because I was so done about what they had like done to me, basically, because they used me. They used me miserably. I worked for them for like free for 5 years and just nothing, you know? So that was when I started to undo from the wilds. And that next summer, I had already accepted a counseling position, and it was their lowest attendance summer ever, which was crazy. They had so few campers that summer I only had 4 in my cabin at a time. Now remember, this was historically when you would have 8 to 10, and I only had 4. And my lead counselor was nasty. Her name was Jen Allen, and she would force me to be in defense all the time because she wanted to win the game. So she wouldn't let anybody's cabin who wasn't athletic play in the offense. They only played defense, which was like really sad. And she would like yell at people if they weren't moving where she wanted them to go. So she made the games just so miserable for everyone. And then she would like tout how she was like trying to do a good thing. I remember all lead counselors were like generation Christians, plus had heavy standings at the camp and stuff. So she made it miserable. And because their attendance was so low, by week 7, they were asking for volunteers to leave. And I was the first one on that list. I ran to the checklist at the back and I wrote my name down. I was like, I'm done. I'm ready to go. Because I knew all the full-time staff members, they actually pulled me in to a meeting asking me like why I was leaving and how useful I was, and wasn't I sure that I wanted to stay because I could impact the ministry so well. And I straight up told them I wanted nothing else to do with it and that I wanted to leave because I was so miserable. And I was like, I'm ready to go home. I don't want to be here anymore. I want to leave. And they were like, we're so disappointed to hear this, but okay, we'll approve you leaving. But they almost didn't. They almost made me stay, even though they were asking for volunteers, because they were like, maybe this is God's will for you to stay. And I was like, no, I don't want to stay. I was like, listen, if you try and make me stay, I'm gonna leave. I'm gonna break my contract. So that was like a big deal. And they're like, all right, well, we'll let you leave. And they offered me another counseling job the next year. And I was so excited to send them back declination. Basically, I was like, no, I'm not ever counseling again. And that was like, I cut all ties. I stopped volunteering on the weekends. I stopped doing May staff. They asked me multiple times, like, why I wasn't coming back on weekends anymore. And I was like, oh, I have a full-time job and I don't have time to do that and stuff. And they were like, we really miss you in the ministry here. And I was like, you didn't though, because you wouldn't hire me as a CA. You clearly didn't need me. I'm not going to do that. So that's how I left the Wilds and what the CA program was. But they had to, the CAs, they had to go on a missions trip every year. They had to go, they had to do, when they were in their downtime, they had a bunch of studies they had to do, and like Bible studies and homework that they had to turn in. Not only were they working them like slaves every day for hours and hours. You've already heard like how many hours we would have to work. They were doing that. So that was basically to replace the weekend staffs. It's because they weren't getting volunteers anymore. So they had this camp apprentice program and they had to cycle through the different things, ops, kitchen, landscaping, waitressing, all of this stuff. And that was when they started doing that. And then that was when they had to do these missions trips and stuff. And even though the church sponsored them, we as town kids weren't allowed to go on these trips because they were only for CAs. So that was interesting too. But they just did this because they were training them for camp ministry. Ironically, I don't think any of them actually did camp ministry. I think most of them like went into some other form of thing, but they would say that at the end of them, they would get them like job offers and stuff in different churches and schools or like internships and stuff, but they were only paying them, I think, $500 every 2 weeks to do this program, plus their food and board. And then the women didn't ever get any opportunities, obviously, because women in ministry was not okay. So it was just the men that were getting that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that and all the details and explaining it. But I know another thing, a big part of the wilds is the camps abroads thing, which from my understanding spreads the wilds like model across to other Christian camps across the world.
Yeah, so they would actually team up with local missionaries. So Matt Collier, who was the pastor at my church, was the one who started Camps Abroad. And then he became the pastor at Bethany, and then he did both of them for a little bit with some help from a few other people. And then when he was leaving Bethany, he stepped down to focus more on his family and Camps Abroad, and then became the director of the Wilds. So his father was the director before him, and there was like a lot there.
Do you know when camps abroad started?
I can find out.
And did I do it justice, or do you want to explain a bit more what camps abroad is?
I can explain a little more, but I think you did a pretty good job of explaining the basic idea of it. So it's camps abroad. They just went to Nicaragua and Kenya. So that's some ideas of what they're doing. There's actually a video on their website But what is their motto? Because all these ministries have mottos.
Oh yeah.
It's worldwide impact, enabling churches on every continent to reach teens through camping. And I'm trying to see when they started. Oh, and it does say on their website they are an official ministry of the Wilds Christian Association in North Carolina. They say they start with a biblical philosophy, identify and equip workers, develop a program, find the right facilities, do all of that. It was in 2000 that they started this. So the Wilds was 1969, and it says a number of missionaries and national pastors have asked for assistance in developing a camp program and philosophy. In 2000, the Wilds Board of Directors established camps abroad as a way to meet some of these needs. Specifically, our goal is to help local churches around the world evangelize the lost and build up believers through biblical Christian camping. But they do have some, we don't do this. So they don't involve themselves long term in any operation. They don't want control of any camp. They don't financially support any camp. They don't ask to be given credit for services provided, because remember, we can't be praised for anything that we do. That would make us not humble, which is on the tree. And we are not seeking to make American camps in other countries, which is a lie. That's what I'm going to get into. They tout this very humanitarian philosophy, but what they are just totally unaware of is different cultures. Remember when we talk about missionaries from the past, most missionaries would go into a country and then maintain all of their westernized beliefs and dress, clothes, food. They wouldn't adjust to the culture at all until I think Hudson Taylor was one of the first ones that like went into a country and became a Chinese citizen and all this stuff to reach people for the gospel. So camps abroad does not change their dress. When they go to these other countries, they look very Western. They will eat some of the food that is there if it's what's being served. But something that they overlook a lot is like they were in Kenya and Nicaragua. These are third world countries where people struggle to just find food to eat. And I remember when I was living in Mongolia, they came over to do a camp with the missionaries that I was working with in a village there. And I had fully adapted to the culture, gone to the gairs. I'd had tea with the people. I was trying to learn Mongolian. I provided medical care for them. I was the only medical personnel in the entire city that I was in. So I like would work with them, but my goal was to like understand their culture and see how they lived. And the thing about camps abroad is they're just not aware of that at all. I remember that they went to a place like Nicaragua or Kenya. And remember when I talked about fun time at teen camp, they would do skits and things like that. One of those skits was like chewing up a banana and spitting it out. And they did that in front of all these starving children in Africa, to the point that several of the children came up to the missionaries that were there that had put in a lot of work to build relationships with them and said, why would they waste food? Like, we would have eaten that if they would have just given it to us. So again, they're taking the wild and trying to put it in these third world countries, and they would do it almost shamelessly sometimes of, we have the perfect model and we're the best at this, so you need to just let us do it. And I remember when they came to Mongolia, the missionaries were a little upset that they were so forceful about how they wanted things done, like the staff training. They wanted it done just like they did it at the Wilds. They wanted them to have calls at the end of the services, just like at the Wilds. And the preaching, they wanted it to be a certain way. And the missionaries were pushing back a little bit, and we're like, that's not really like Mongolian culture, though. So we should adjust a few things. And they were very opposed to it, and it caused some strife. And then after they left, they changed the whole camp model to fit Mongolian culture. And they do that in Africa and everywhere too. I know of another missionary family in South Africa that I was really close to. And they told me that after Camps Abroad came and they did that skit with the banana, that they lost a lot of kids coming to like different things because it was so like cringy basically, and that they were so like, we are doing it this way, that they didn't really let them adjust it. And when they brought suggestions forward, they were like, we've done this and you haven't, and look how successful we've been. And the missionaries were like, but we need to make adjustments. They were like, the equipment they brought was nice, but we almost wish they hadn't even brought it, because they were so much, we're doing this. And the staff training binder is exactly the same for everyone in English with the tree, all of it. And they were very big on pushing that and doing staff training with these counselors and wanting the counselors to stay with their cabins and like all of this stuff. And it's just not how things were done in that country. So it was really awkward. And like the music, really not okay with the traditional. In Africa, there's a lot of drums and movement and like worshiping while you're dancing and things like that. That was how they worshiped there in South Africa. And they were like opposed to that. So there was several things that they brought up that were like, it was nice that they brought the equipment, but we wish they hadn't even come because we feel like we have to start from scratch anyways. So that's Camps Abroad, and it's run by Matt Collier. They don't have a problem with it. They seem to think that it's just westernized camping, one size fits all. Everyone can do that, from Nicaragua to Mongolia. It doesn't matter. We can have the wilds anywhere. So it's really cringy.
Yeah, oh my gosh. I just, when you told the story of the spitting out the banana, I'm like, how can you just not think of that?
I don't know. They were seeing what these kids were eating, a cup of rice with a little bit of fish in it. And it's like they don't even see that anyone else is suffering in the world. And they just live in this rose-colored glasses. And they're like, oh, yeah, this is funny in America, so it'll be funny anywhere. And it's like, no, it's not. And the jokes, the fun time, a lot of the kids didn't even get that. And they always tote about how kids can have fun in any country with this. Their big thing about fun time is that you don't need crass remarks, you don't need crude jokes. Look how much fun we're having without any of that. And that's what they try and push in other countries as well, but it's all westernized. They don't get a lot of it, or some of it. They're like, the banana is just like painfully awkward to watch. It is really interesting.
Yeah, oh my gosh. Because when I learned about Camps Abroad, I was like, oh, yay, we're spreading this everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's their goal. That's their goal, is to take Christian camping worldwide. That is
oh,
the motto. So it is really cringy, which
yeah.
kind of leads right into the Wilds and how it got started. So they were founded in 1969 by three guys who came and decided to buy this property. Ken Hay was one of the founders. And when you came on as like a staff member, you were actually forced to meet with him. At this point, he was like 90 years old. He was so old when I was a staff member. And we would have to go and sit down, and he would basically be like, don't screw this up. I've worked really hard to like get this here, and you're here to minister and sacrifice. And where are you from? And what do you do? And how did you get saved? And why did you decide to work at the Wilds? And just like all this stuff. And was like, basically, I meet with every single staff member that ever starts here, because I want to make sure that you guys are all here for the right reasons. It's really, it's very awkward, because you're just sat in this room in this scheduled meeting with a whole bunch of people that you've never met before, and you have to tell them why this happened. And the other founder was Walter Fremont, who we know from your podcast about surviving BJU was a massive problem. And he was the other like big founder with Ken Hay. So you can imagine that. I've talked a little bit about how the inn was named after him. So that was that. And then they had the Wilds of the Rockies, which was in Colorado. It didn't last very long. They ended up closing that camp. And then they opened the Wilds of New England, where Rand Pummel is the director. That camp has gone that. So all these big names that everyone hears over and over again are directly responsible with starting these camps. And they were directly involved with BJ as well, to the point that all the staff kids got free tuition to Bob Jones. And there was a lot of perks for Bob Jones people coming up to the wilds, going down to Bob Jones. They would do recruiting for summer camp there for counselors with booths and things like that.
Yes, I remember them recruiting at Bob Jones University when I was there. And yeah, when I got to Bob Jones, I think I had maybe heard of the Wilds before, but my IFB church, we had our own camp that we owned in the hills of Virginia. And when I got to Bob Jones, I can't remember if I told this story in a previous episode or not. But anyways, I'll have to leave this out if I did. There was a girl in like my English 101 class at Bob Jones who loved the wilds and tried to convince me to work there. She's, oh my gosh, you have to. She's like, the booth is here. Like, it's so great. We're like family. That was one of the things she had said. A red flag now looking back. Like, that's just,
Yes, we're all one weird family, but we're family. But yeah, they would recruit, they would send the CAs to all the different college campuses with one of the full-time, only the male CAs, not the females. I remember females are a subclass for males. So the male CAs would go with the full-time staff members to the different Christian colleges to recruit, and they would ask people to come and they would talk about how great it was to be at the wilds, and especially men. They had a hard time getting men to sign up for this because they made no money. So they would really push for like guys to come and do the ministry for the summer, especially the Bible majors. They really pushed hard on those Bible majors and the biblical counseling majors and the pastoral studies majors. All of those were the ones they really wanted. If you were in like art or something, they were like, oh yeah, you should come. But everyone else, they were like, the pastoral studies and stuff, they're like, oh, you really want to come minister here at the wilds. So that's, what it is. I love that on their website, they say, wow, this place has really changed since I was a camper years ago, but in some ways it's still the same place. Does that make sense? And they're like, yes, it does make sense. It is as important to grow and to progress as it is to remain faithful in the areas that matter for eternity. May we always rely on the grace of God to keep us true to Him. So they have received like a lot of backlash, especially about fashion and music, and they just refuse to change. I was told that Matt Herbster stepped down because the board was so unwilling to make any concessions. They were like, no, we are the same place. We're going to stay the same. We're not going to change anything. And that's why he stepped down. And he actually went to Hong Kong. But back to like how the wilds got started, they bought this land. I think it started as like 1,000 acres, and they've built all of the buildings on it with fundraising. So people are just donating money. It's not like they're working to pay for a lot of it. Most of the camper tuition and stuff doesn't really seem to cover much of the expenses. They rely a lot on like supporting churches and people that want it to stay the way it is. And then the board, of course, is heavily involved. So just like Bob Jones, like the Bob Jones family was so involved, and it was really hard to make any changes. Same thing at the Wilds. There are these old founding members that are just, they will not budge on anything. Steve Leatherwood, I think he was involved with Bob Jones somewhat, but he's the lawyer for the camp. He's like the head lawyer. So he's very against change as well. And then Ken Collier like really joined right away and has been there a long time too. So that kind of leads us into leaving the wilds as like staff. So the full-time staff, what happens to them? So initially, I think they had good intentions of giving these people pensions and retirement, and then they realized that they couldn't really afford that. So their biggest push was getting rid of the old people that had been there their whole lives to put in these newer people that they could pay less and not keep as long. So that was a big goal.
Oh wow, this sounds familiar. I feel like another institution promised retirement and then didn't follow through. Oh yeah, Bob Jones, that's
Yes.
right. Oh
Well, they
yeah,
all follow the same model. We already know this.
we
So
do.
they did the same thing, basically. So I remember that the kitchen was Cal Mayer's zone. He was in charge of the kitchen for most of my life. Because again, all these people came to my church, so I knew Cal. And then when he got older, they felt like some of his ideas were not what they wanted or they weren't as economical because he ran a tight ship. That kitchen always got 100% on their scores, their sanitation scores, because he would have you scrub and scrub a countertop with Brillo till your hands were bleeding to make it like as shiny as possible. So he had two cooks under him. One of them was his son, Jonathan Mayer, who had worked there his whole life from childhood up. And then there was Matt Tracy. Now, Matt Tracy was a bully, and Matt Tracy was also very condescending, felt like he knew everything. And then on the other side of the kitchen, so there's the kitchen and dish staff that was in charge of like Cal. Then there was Connie Henry, and she was the head waitress my entire life. Like, I knew that she was there. She was this single woman who had served in that ministry for so long, and she had a house up right by the hill. And it was actually like apart from all of the other staff housing, which was interesting because she was like a single woman and it was right by the gate. But they like, yeah, her and this other woman shared that house. And she always did the waitressing, and she was very big on everything being even, and like you had to straighten all the silverware, you had to straighten all the plates, you had to straighten everything. She was very big on efficiency and like getting things done quickly and straightening everything. And Matt Tracy basically said he could do it without her. He didn't need Connie anymore. And they didn't want Cal anymore. So they basically told him that they were moving him to be the director of Cool Beans, which was like their coffee shop on campus, which was a massive downgrade. And then they just promoted Matt Tracy over Jonathan Mayer, who had grown up there and been in the kitchen with his dad the entire life. So Matt Tracy took over the kitchen with Jonathan being like his assistant. And then Matt and Connie didn't really get along because Cal was like very much like everything has to be done well and efficiently. And Matt was all about cutting corners and getting things done as quickly as possible. So rather than quality, he focused on quantity. So he said he couldn't work with Connie anymore, and they fired her. So this woman who literally had worked there from her 20s all the way to her 40s, so we're talking 20 years of service. They had Matt Herbster didn't want to tell her, so he had Ken Collier pull her in and basically tell her that she was no longer needed. They gave her like a parting check and then said goodbye and took her house, took everything. So she couldn't stay in the house anymore. She had to leave completely from the campsite because all the full-time staff live on the property in houses that have been built for them. So she ended up moving to the Raleigh area, but had a super hard time finding a job because she had nothing on her resume. She had 20 years being a head waitress. What kind of job are you going to get with that? So the thing is, once they leave, they have to find another ministry to get into or someone who knows somebody from a ministry. So basically, she moved to this church where her ex-roommate had moved to because she hadn't been with her and they'd lived together their whole lives. So she moved there, they moved in together, and a friend of the church, knew a doctor who was an optometrist that was looking for a practice manager, and she got the position and has been there ever since because she has nothing on her resume. She can't go anywhere else. She has to stay there. So she's worked as a practice manager at this eye office for forever. And she cried and cried. I was there the day that they told her. She cried because she thought she'd spend her life in camp ministry. And they basically were like, we don't need you anymore. And they didn't replace her. They used the CAs to fill her spot because they only paid them $500 every 2 weeks. So they would have a different CA every 2 weeks run the kitchen, basically. And then Matt Tracy was in charge of that now too. So he got more power out of it. He got rid of the person he didn't like. And now the camp benefits because they don't have to pay these people or give them any kind of retirement or house or anything. Because they just lived in these like cabins right by the kitchen with a bunch of other people, 4 other people. So it was just so cringy that happened. So that was one person. So then when my parents got kicked out of the church, only one person from the Wild stood up and said that it was wrong, and his name was Doug Gorsline, and he was the landscape guy. Doug and his family were probably the most progressive ones there. Their kids listened to like real music. Their son joined the military, which I know seems like not that big of a deal, but that was like, he didn't go into ministry. And then his like other son was the wild card, married a girl that wasn't exactly the height of Wild's fashion, if I can use that terminology. And they replaced him with CAs, got rid of him too. They were like, goodbye. And so now he had to move to Greenville and start his own landscaping company. Because again, what else has he done? Just landscaping. When that whole year of COVID happened, their master plumber that lived there on the thing, and I don't know what you know about like the trades, but master plumbers make a lot of money. He had to go work at Lowe's in their like furniture department just to pay for food for them to eat because the Wilds couldn't afford to give them food anymore because they didn't make enough money over the summer to support the staff. Then Joe Fant, who was Tom Farrell's son-in-law, married his daughter. They moved to Colonial Hills Baptist Church and became youth pastor or assistant pastors. I think now he might be one of the head pastors. They have a bunch of pastors. And then right after him, Matt Tracy up and left with his family to Colonial Hills Baptist Church. And that is the church where Chuck Phelps is the pastor, or was, and he was the one that famously covered up the use in New England.
This has been coming up a lot in this series. Okay,
Yeah.
now so when he fled from Trinity Baptist Church, where that horrible thing happened, he then ran to Colonial Hills to have his own rebuild his reputation and pretend that never happened.
Mm-hmm. And
Okay.
now all of these people that have left the Wilds are going to this church.
Okay, now I'm really curious about Colonial Hills now. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh.
Yeah, I told you there was like, they have their own scandals as well, but that was them. So they left there. And then all of the staff that I knew like my entire life, most of them have been politely moved off the property to either retirement. Like, so I think like Ken Collier got a retirement from like the Wilds because he was like one of the founding members almost. Like if he wasn't one of the founding, but he was like right after and had been there his entire life. So he got like a retirement. Ken Hay obviously did very well. He had a very nice house in Greenville as well as a very nice car, which is again really cringy when you think about what they were paying people in general, met the Christian stereotype of being bad employers. And then a lot of the other staff members have now left. So Gary Williams, who grew up there, who was like the lawyer there, when he stood up about something, he then very quickly afterwards was given like his resignation. And again, they don't ever like say it like we're firing you. We're letting you move on to other opportunities. We're opening these homes for these younger families that have now joined us. But then nobody lasts very long because they have no future. And that's like the kind of the hardest part for me is that they leave and they have no real work experience. So they have nowhere to go. So they have to either start their own companies or again get involved in a ministry that lets them like work in what they've been respected in, or they have to like find somebody that will let them work. But a lot of them moved to Greenville because I'm Bob Jones and the hubs and like all the churches down there. But it's just silent. It's
Yeah.
like this mass exodus that nobody really talks about, but that I knew about because I was involved in the church. So I always knew when these people were leaving and they were like, yeah, we don't really want to go, but the Wilds. can't afford to keep us anymore, or we don't really want to go, but this is a better opportunity for us. It's God's will. It's always God's will for us to lose our homes and our lives and our jobs and everything. It's God's will. He sent this to try us. So it's just so cringy because in any other world, this would have been called out right away and they would be held legally liable. And it's sad because these people just trusted them because they're a Christian organization to do the right thing and they didn't. So that's painful, which kind of leads me into how they robbed a missionary family. So Steve Leatherwood, the lawyer of the wilds. When I knew these people my whole life, I was friends with them. They are firm believers, but they've had a very different upbringing than the IFB movement. They've been in all sorts of different churches and different belief systems, were missionaries overseas. So they're more open-minded, not quite as there's only one way you can worship, only one way to believe, but I wouldn't classify them as progressive. They're just more open-minded. I knew them. They took care of this old woman who had a bunch of property that butted up against the wilds. She was not a believer, and she had 100 cats, and her house was condemned. So before her house was condemned and she lived like that, she decided to donate her property to the wilds and to this missionary family. So it was 100 acres. And she gave 50 to the wilds and 50 to this missionary family. And this missionary family built their home on it from themselves. Like they cut down the trees and sawed and milled all of the planks themselves. They built it from the ground up by themselves. And they are like the hardest working people I've ever seen. And they built this land so that their kids would have something because they were missionaries. So they don't have retirement. They don't have things like that. So this was like their thing to give their kids when they passed. They would stay here when they were here on furlough at this house, which is on Frozen Creek, which abuts right against the wilds. So Steve Leatherwood and a few other people were responsible for drawing up the documents. And they were like, don't worry about it. We're going to take care of it. We'll draw up all the legal documents and we'll make sure all the land is protected and blah, blah, blah. And we'll take care of it for free so you don't have to hire a lawyer. And of course they trusted them because they're the Wilds. They're this Christian organization. They couldn't possibly do anything underhanded or wrong, right? They found out, I would say, like 10 years after this, they built their house and everything, that the Wilds had written them out of 25 acres. So the Wilds had taken 75 acres and given them 25. And they built this cabin. They moved this woman into the basement. She actually destroyed the basement and they had to redo it because of all her cats and stuff. But they did it to take care of her. And then she died while they were overseas. And I guess the Wilds saw this as a window of opportunity. So she died. And that's when this will and the paperwork came to light. And that's when they found out. And not only that, but they basically told them that after this missionary couple died in the future, that all this land reverts to the Wilds, not their kids. Mind you, the Wilds has 800 acres. But they wanted this 50 acres because it butts up against JBC. And they wanted to turn it into the JBC camp area. So they basically wrote the will of this woman to take the first 25 acres. The missionary family just said, okay, we're not going to make a big deal about it. We still have 25 acres. Then they found out that they basically took another 15 of that. So now have left them with only 10 acres. And they started to fight them at this point and were like, oh, what are you doing? And that's when they saw the legal paperwork. When they got their lawyer involved, their lawyer said, what happened here? Basically, they've made it so that the land and the home that you guys built with your own hands reverts to them after you die. So they basically stole all of their land. But then that's just the start of it. So when they went to them and started pressing them on it. And we're like, hey, we trusted you guys because you're this Christian organization. They got nasty. Steve Leatherwood started fighting back on them and was like, this is for the ministry, and this is how it was supposed to be, and this is what we're doing. And they were able to finally reach an agreement after threatening to take them to court, where the land and the house will stay through their kids' lives, but then not their grandkids. So when their youngest son dies, all the land reverts back to the wilds. And that was the farthest agreement they could come to. Now, mind you, this family, their youngest son married one of the staff kids. Their whole family was very involved with this camp because they lived right there and they were very supportive of them. Camps Abroad came to their mission field and did a camp there. Very involved, and basically got their shirts taken off their back and stabbed in the back by this Christian organization. And that's that. It's just crazy that they did that, but there was no ramifications. And that's when Gary Williams started to speak up about it. And that's when he was politely asked to resign, was when he started questioning their decision to take this missionary family's land. Which again, this is like 25 acres. They have 800, but they wanted this 25 acres. To the point now that the staff kids believe it's their land and they'll come down on their property and fish in their creek and hunt on their land without telling them or giving any permission or anything like that.
This doesn't surprise me at all, honestly. It's so horrible. And yeah, just so greedy and despicable. Like you said, they have 800 acres, but they wanted that and then lying to them and they trusted them. And yeah, oh my gosh, horrible.
Which I guess leads into like our next thing about just some of the scandals that have occurred that nobody's ever really talked about. Deaths that were never really investigated super intensely, injuries that occurred. So I remember that you used to, as a counselor, have to cut your own firewood for your fires with your campers. And they stopped that because a girl counselor who'd never used an axe before cut her thumb off and was having to take to the hospital right away. Another person that I knew was at the lake and he went to dive in, which was very stupid, but he went to dive in and broke his neck and had to be like in the halo with his head all screwed into it. And the Wilds basically said that it was his own fault and that he shouldn't have done that, and how it was so stupid, and how they hoped it was a lesson for us not to like do things that we shouldn't do. So again, we just found out this guy we all knew had broken his neck, and they were just like so unsympathetic. We went to the hospital and we prayed over him, but we also were like, this was God like telling you that what you were doing was wrong. And I was like, he just broke his neck. I think we cut him some slack for a few days, guys. This is the same thing. Like a girl was on the trail with a hiking buddy and a snake bit her, a copperhead, and her legs swelled up so much and she couldn't counsel for the first month. And they talked about how we shouldn't really be hiking out there without a hike leader. That was something that could have stopped that. It was like they always used things like that as a lesson for why we shouldn't do what was wrong. One of the girl counselors that I knew, on the weekends in your cabins, the girls' cabin area butted up against a national forest. So there were hikers and stuff that would sometimes come through. One day she was in the shower and she stepped out of the shower and there was a man just standing in her cabin, this random man. And she was like, what are you doing here? And he ran away, and come to find out he was a sex offender that was like in the girls' cabin area. And again, instead of thinking about how horrible the situation was and like promote safety and things like that, they basically were like, it was her fault because she didn't lock the door to her cabin. but we didn't have keys. Like, why would we lock the door to our cabins? We didn't have keys anyways. They got to the point where they started locking everyone in their cabins at night for a little bit because of this until they caught this guy. But they again made it her fault, which was just, they were like, you should be more aware of your surroundings,
Oh my
things like
God.
that. So it was so like horrible. And then there was a counselor that couldn't swim, and somehow she got talked into jumping into the lake, and she drowned and died there in the lake. And they didn't find her for a long time because they didn't realize she was missing.
Oh my God.
So this is when the buddy checks started at the lake, where they would have you like whistle, and like you had to hold up your buddy's hand and you had to stay within 3 feet of your buddy at all times. But she drowned, and it wasn't until dinner that they realized she was missing because her campers couldn't find her. They all showed up for dinner and she wasn't there. So that's when they went back to the lake, and they actually had to call in a dive crew, and they found her body and then had to tell her parents that she died there. But nobody really investigated it. Like, again, law enforcement wasn't involved. It was just that she died. And they didn't really talk about it either. They just talked about how she had passed, but they didn't really say how that had happened. And then there was another time, there's like this giant swing, and this guy got on the giant swing and he'd ridden it before, and the cable snapped and he died. Like, he fell and died. Because this thing is like a 60-foot drop. You have to wear a hang gliding harness.
Oh my God.
So he fell. This was like an earlier model of it. And supposedly his parents like gave money to make it safer and donated it to his memory or whatever, but it was just really bad. So that happened. Those are like some of the big things that I can remember, like people dying where things weren't really investigated. Again, things like happened and nobody really talked about it. I remember one time they said that somebody went over Third Falls, and that's why they like closed that hike down because it was too dangerous. And like Fourth Falls hike that they encouraged campers to go on, you had to climb up a rock face with a rope like in your hands from the waterfall, so your shoes are wet and you're like having to climb up rocks to get to the top. And these are like not experienced hikers. These are kids, and they're rocks with like snakes and stuff, and you had to be careful. They would always have a lifeguard go in front to try and clear the path of any snakes, but they weren't always successful at that. And then the swine flu like epidemic that happened, and they didn't shut the camp down. And then the COVID happened and they didn't shut the camp down, and people got COVID and swine flu. They were super spreaders for both of those. And then when this huge flooding happened, like it wiped out some of the bridges, like one of the bridges to the guys' cabin area. So they had the guys hike through the rain at night up the hill and then down the hill with like only people holding lanterns along the way to get them back to their cabins. And then they had to clear the river. So they had landscaping guys like hanging from ropes, cutting trees in the water. It's just unsafe, some of the stuff that they do, and they just don't take precautions. Like having that sewer right next to a bunch of junior boot campers, things like that, that they just don't talk about and are really unsafe. And even, I know in some of the comments from when you posted about our chats, there were open fractures all the time from the games because they would tell them you have to try your hardest. One of the games was this giant big ball with all these colors, and you had to run at it and push it to a line and get it over the line. And there's the three teams trying to get it over the line, and they're all pushing at it, and people would get trapped underneath it. Fingers would get caught in the ropes and they would break their fingers. They would have like bruising. I'm talking like horrible injuries. I remember one time we were playing Capture the Flag when I was a junior boot camp person, like not a camp counselor, but as a camper. And this counselor pushed a child to the ground and ripped the flag from her hands, and she pushed her into thorn bushes because she wanted to win the game against these 9-year-olds. But they don't do
God, horrible.
any checks on these people before they become counselors. I remember, okay, so this is like the craziest. I have 2 crazy counseling stories where things were just unsafe and they just don't talk about it. So, one of the things you had to keep an eye out for was if any campers brought weapons to the campsite with them. So that was like a big thing. And they actually used to have an archery range and a shooting range, and they cut those off after the school shootings where Columbine and things like that, they stopped offering that as a activity because they were giving 22s to teenagers and letting them shoot them. This is real ammo. I'm not talking BB guns.
Oh my God.
These were 22s that you were shooting. And they would also have real arrows. And I remember somebody got one in their eye. They had to have surgery because of that. All this stuff happened all the time. The injuries were
This
crazy.
is wild. Oh
Yeah.
my God. This is
Yeah, like I mean,
wild.
like the last frontier. All things go except like dating. You can't date anybody, but you can shoot 22s and arrows at each other. So it's just
So something I want to ask, I don't know if we had said this yet or not, but could you list all the years of your involvement through different camps and things as you did?
so my first year at JBC was 2004 as like a camper. And then I was a camper until I was like 15. So that would have been another 6 years. So from 2004 to 2010, I was a camper. I remember 2010, I went to CIT. That was my last year as a camper. So from 2011, 12, 13, 14, 2010 to 2014, I was a staff member, maybe a little longer, up to 2015. So I was like involved with the camp from 2009 to 2016, like actively. But I also grew up in the church, so I knew all of the full-time staff members from the time I was born. So that was 95. So from 1995 until 2009, I was just in the church with all of them. So that's a really long time. And very little changed in those decades. So, besides the archery range going away. So, one of the other things that happened, or one of the things that they would talk about, is if you had violent campers. So, I remember one time that we had a group of gang kids that somehow ended up coming to camp. I think one of the inner city churches sponsored for them to come, and they showed up and they were basically like, we hate this place and we are fully intent on killing our counselor. Killing our counselor. So the counselor that was in there was like a slight guy. He wasn't a very big guy, and he was like a pastoral major. Like he wasn't anything like, he was not a football player. He wasn't anything big. They beat the crap out of him the first night. And he ended up getting pulled from that cabin. And instead of thinking, maybe we should kick these people out, because they did do that. If you broke too many rules as a camper, they would actually send you home. But they decided not to do that. They put one of the staff kids, who was a bigger guy, in the cabin with the full knowledge that these guys were crazy. The first night, he fell asleep and he woke up with a baseball bat above his head. Like the kid was holding it up over his head, about to bring it down on his head. And he grabbed it and told him to go back to sleep. And he got the lead counselor in there. They had to take turns sleeping and watching all of the kids with a weapon in their hands, like a bat. I had a camper who only spoke in meows to me the whole week, and it was creepy, whatever. And I remember I fell asleep one night and I woke up to her just staring at me, like standing by my bed, staring at me. And I was like, "What are you doing?" And she was like, "Just imagining how you die." And I was like, "You need to go back to bed, face the wall, don't look at me anymore." But things like that happened all the time, where you would have these violent campers that just were, I would hope that I could have taken her. She was like 12, but there were campers that were absolutely violent. There was another one that came that was convinced he was a wizard. His mother was a witch. Supposedly, this is the story. He had two moms, which was already a thing, and they preach heavily against the LGBTQ community. So they were very much, your mothers are living in sin. And his one mom was a witch and part of the coven, and he was a wizard. And he supposedly put a curse on like the guy's cabin area, and they like came and prayed over him one night, like a bunch of the full-time men staff, and they spoke very like highly about it, about how they had prayed over this wizard kid. But that's the kind of stuff they had, was like they felt like that was an actual demonic presence there that they had to expel from the campsite. But if any campers really did get like super out of control, they would send them home. Or if you got caught with a weapon, they would send you home. So that was some of the like scandals that happened there. So I was involved with the camp for a very long time. Enough to have all these stories.
Oh my gosh, yes, so many. Yeah, so you already did talk about your leaving of it and getting out, but they did end up reaching out to you again. And had you talked about that before or not?
I don't think so. So I know I've talked about the counseling sessions I had to go through to leave Bethany, but with the Wilds, I remember that they came to visit me one time, like a group of them, because they wanted to go to the Ark Encounter, and I was living in Cincinnati at the time, and they were telling me that I should go to lunch with them, and I did, and they asked if I was in church, and I wasn't. And I was very honest about it. I was like, I'm not in church right now. And they were like, "Oh, Tabitha, you are a special one to us. We're going to pray for you to get back on track with God." They've reached out like a couple times about just, what are you doing? Where are you? They're always really surprised to find out I live in the same town again that I grew up in. They'll reach out a lot about my family and be like, "We really miss your family at church." But they were the ones that like voted to remove my family from church. It's always like a little cringy. Or I ran into a few people that invited me to come back to the Wilds and were telling me about how much has changed and how progressive they are and how I would be so welcome there, and I should come and see and do game night with them one night. Right now, what I get the most of is just this love bombing of, we still want you here, and we're not the ones that are rejecting you. You have a choice to come back. We still care about you. What's really funny is that they messaged me and they asked about, "Hey, we saw you like live on social media the other day, and we were just wondering how you're doing." And as soon as I mentioned that I'm divorced and living with my fiance, they never speak to me again. That's interesting. "Oh, yeah, we should definitely get together sometime." And then it's crickets. I never hear from them again, which kind of leads me into leaving the Wilds and just the impact that it had on my life, if you are okay with me sharing that.
Oh yeah, most definitely.
Growing up, so we're talking 1995 to 2016, that's over 20 years total at this place, in this church. And even when I left the Wilds and Bethany, I still was in another church for a while. I ended up going to an Anglican church where I did a youth ministry for a little bit, which they would not have approved of because I was very supportive of these kids. I had several queer kids in my group that I fully embraced and wanted there, and they would have looked really badly on that. That would have been a big no. We should encourage them to give up this sinful lifestyle. And I didn't believe that, even when they tried to tout that in my youth, that this was the most abominable sin that you could be, was to be queer. And they would quote that verse in scripture that talks about homosexuality being an abomination, and Sodom and Gomorrah. and all of that. And so I digressed slowly over time away from Christianity. It wasn't like I just one day woke up and was like, I'm not going to be a Christian anymore. I'm not going to believe in God anymore. I am done, and stepped away from the ministry. It was a slow leaving for me and a slow repositioning. And it took a lot for me to even leave because, again, they contact you for forever. I still get messages, and I've been out of this church out of this group, out of the wilds for over, 7 years now. And I still get messages from them. And I live in the same town as them, and I never see them. That's the thing. I never see anyone from the wilds in this town. This is not a big town. If anybody came to visit Brevard, they wouldn't really even know that they had been in the town. It's very small. There's 2 grocery stores. There's a Walmart. That's it. You have to drive to Asheville or Greenville if you want anything big. Everyone here does a lot of hiking, outdoorsy stuff. So there's 2 grocery stores, and I never see them there because they're so contained. They eat there, they live there, they go to church together, they visit only the people in the churches, because they would preach about being light and salt to the world, but that light could lose its light, or salt could lose its savor if we don't stay together as a group. So they would really say, like, we want to reach out to the world, but you don't want to be part of the world. So the not being part of the world is the thing that they do the most of. They really aren't in the community, that hardly at all. And the few that are tend to be very zealous about getting you to come to church. And then they'll get you there. And again, it's all this love bombing and all of this. We want you here, and we're so accepting. And then once you're there, they start to indoctrinate you. So it's really hard. But that not seeing them in the community is so interesting to me because it's such a small group and it's such a small town. And to not see them, I've lived back in this town for 3 years now. I've run into one person and they didn't even recognize me. So that's the shock. They don't follow you after this. They don't check like how you're doing. It's like you're dead to them. Just like the cults where you do actually leave, you're no longer considered part of them. It's very similar to that. You're just not a part of them anymore because you've chosen a different path.
Yeah, it sounds like Jehovah's Witnesses response. They're like excommunicated, shunned, you're nothing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So they don't even, most of them don't even know that I still live here because they don't care. They don't reach out to see how we're doing or anything like that. But having come back to this community was like a really hard thing for me because I moved away to get away from everything, the memories and all of that, because I know I had like a slower digression, but once I left, I lost everything. My whole community, all of my friends. I was in 2 people's weddings that I don't even talk to anymore because I'm not considered worthy to speak to. Or the one time that one of them reached out to me, she was like, I'm praying for your soul. So it's just, they completely take you away. You're not even part of them anymore. They're like, we don't know what to talk to you about because we don't have the same interests about God anymore. And it's like they can't be just normal people. So you lose your whole identity. You lose everything you thought you were, everything I thought I was going to be. Like all of that changed almost overnight. And I had to start fresh, which was really hard because I didn't have any shared experiences. So when you would meet somebody, most of the time when you go out and you talk to someone for the first time, it's, hi, what's your name? Where are you from? How many siblings do you have? What's your family like? How did you grow up? Where did you grow up? And then it moves into, tell me about your school. And what am I going to say? I went to a cult school where they engaged in Nazi-like behaviors and were racist and sexist and misogynistic, and they taught a curriculum that only taught creationism. So I don't understand any of the modern sciences because I never learned them, because they don't believe that the world is more than 10,000 years old. And then they're like, tell me about like your friends and stuff growing up. I don't have any because all of them are gone. They all are part of this group. Tell me about your prom. You weren't allowed to go to prom because that involved sinful music and dancing and being with people that weren't part of your group. So you didn't go to prom. I didn't date anybody. I didn't have any first date experiences. It really affected me in my first marriage because I married somebody just to escape the environment and ended up in a really horrible relationship. And I got divorced and I'm out of that now and I'm in like a very healthy space, but it took counseling, it took therapy, it took years of me unpacking all this repressed trauma and all the things that happened to me at the camp, at the church, just everything they did. And I remember meeting another guy that left the church and he was really struggling for a while. And thankfully, I think he's found some peace, but there's just a lack of community that you don't have anymore because it's just gone overnight. You lose everything that you thought. And the thing about it is sometimes you miss it, which is really messed up because you knew where you belonged. You knew every Sunday you were going to go to church. You knew every Wednesday you were going to be in prayer service. You knew every weekend you were going to be working at the Wilds. You knew every summer you were going to be at the Wilds. You knew who all your friends were going to be. You knew who everyone was. You knew your whole community. And then you go from having all of that planned out for you, where you're going to go to college, what you're going to do, who you're going to marry. Like all of it is planned out for you, and everyone lives the same life. And then all of a sudden that's gone, and you're just at square one, and you've never done dating, and you've never done college, and you've never done any actual activities out in public with people. You've never gone dancing. You've never done any of that. So you're like trying to learn how to fit into a world that
Yeah.
you've never been a part of and that everyone else has. And it can be so awkward and lonely.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're like, I wish I still had that community because I knew it was comfortable. Because even though it was horrible and traumatic and terrible, and I would never wish to go back, it was comfortable because you knew exactly what to expect. So that's the hard part about leaving places like
Yeah.
that. So if anyone out there is feeling that, it's okay. You will be able to move on and find a new identity and learn yourself and learn that it's okay to be sad some days and you don't have to be happy all the time. Like the documentary Shiny Happy People, you don't have to be shiny happy people all the time. You can be sad, you can be depressed, you can be scared, you can be lonely, and that is a normal emotion that you can have and process in a normal way. And I'm not a counselor, so by all means go to therapy because I am not a counselor and I would not try and tout the Wilds' belief that anyone can counsel. But if you're feeling those things, it's okay, because that's something that I think was the hardest thing for me, was to not have to be happy all the time.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I relate to all of what you were saying because it's just a lot of survivors describe it. It's just you feel so alien in this world, and so, and even just sometimes even you feel like a child because you're just so behind on so many things, and even like developmentally too, because you're deprived of a lot of these needs that were not recognized as needs at all. And it can be hard because people, you can meet really nice people, but they don't know how to react to
Yeah.
that either. There's that shame. And they make this promise of, oh, you'll be happy if you're here. If you go out there, you'll be miserable, blah, blah. You'll never find happiness. Is evil. There's awful people. Terrible things will happen to you. And it's almost as if I feel like there's this resistance of, oh, like it's just because you leave the cult doesn't mean the cult leaves you. So there's still that pressure on yourself to be happy or to prove that you're living a happy life. And you just have to get to a point where, you know what, I didn't leave this to force myself to be this way. I need to accept every part of this. And you told stories of people they'd experienced horrible things, but it was just crazy the way they would frame it. Oh, this is God's plan, or oh, this is how this worked out. But it's sometimes you have to come to the reality of things and deal with that reality. And it sucks. Honestly, it does. But you can't grow if you deny that.
I think part of their biggest way of keeping people in this is that they make you doubt everyone else around you. So if they're not Christian, if they're not following this specific guideline, if they don't believe in the Trinity and that you should be baptized after you're saved. So even if you're Catholic, let's like that's a low level. Even if you're Catholic, if you're LGBT, they really promoted pray the gay away and things like that. And they make you believe that everyone out there is your enemy and that they are going to corrupt you. And that if you let them too close to you, they're going to like cause you to go to hell. It's all fear tactics and stuff. So I think part of the hardest part of leaving and making friends elsewhere was not mistrusting all of their intentions and recognizing that there's good people that aren't Christian or that aren't this perfect cookie cutter mold that they said was the only way that you could have a good life. And even breaking down the racism walls that they put up, biracial dating that they were very opposed to, all of that is so hard because you've been told your whole life that these are bad people and that you can't trust them. So then you leave and you've lost your whole community, and the only people you're meeting are people that have never been part of the community. And you have to try and break down all those stereotypes that you've been told your whole life are wrong. And that was part of the reason I think I talked about in the first episode of leaving the church was I disagreed with them because I was friends with all the goth kids in high school and they were so nice to me. And all of the Christian kids I went to school with were so mean to me and were bullies. And I realized that this picture they painted of how I would be persecuted outside of the system. And they talked a lot about that, about facing persecution and facing people who would challenge your faith and leaving that and realizing, oh, people actually don't give a fuck what you believe. They really don't care. They're like, oh, that's fine for you. You do you, man. I'm going to do me. You do you. And I think that to me was when I had the biggest wake up call was like, it doesn't matter what they believe. It doesn't matter what I believe. I can believe what I believe and they can believe what they believe, and we can coexist in the same room and still have a great time because we don't have to talk about God all the time. And we don't have to be happy all the time. And we don't have to only talk about church and ministry all the time. We can talk about sports and school and activities and things we like, and it's okay. So I think that was probably one of the harder things about leaving that is not mistrusting everyone around me to corrupt me to becoming something else, but also like giving up all of that community and being alone for the first time where I didn't have anybody that I could just call. Like I used to have 20 people on my phone that I could call at any time. I could go to the wilds at any time, drive in, see whoever I wanted to see. They didn't care. They didn't make you check in at the office. I lost all of that because I left and chose a different path, and so that it's hard. Leaving your community is hard. Trying to forge new barriers is hard. Trying to meet new people is hard. And it's okay. Part of life.
Yes, it is. It is so hard. And just thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that difficult journey. And it is so isolating. And I think when you experience these things and you know that there are other survivors and other people who experience this, even if you can just talk to them online, like it makes you feel so much less alone. It makes you feel less out of place, less strange and alien and lesser than. And it's just also just battling the feelings of worthlessness. That's a whole other thing. But there is hope, there is healing, and you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be.
You don't have to be a shiny, happy person all the time. And you don't have to believe that every bad thing that happens to you is God's will. Sometimes bad things just happen and it's
Yeah.
okay to be upset about them. So
Yeah.
that is interesting to see. And I agree with you, Andrew, that finding like a community of survivors, because trying to explain this stuff to a normal person who's had a normal, nobody's normal, right? But a more traditional life can be really hard because one, they either are just like totally mind blown that anyone has ever gone through this. And I think that's part of the reason that we, as survivors, are speaking out, is so that it is brought to the surface, because the IFB movement is still really real and out there, especially in the South. And then also just being able to find healing with a group of people that know your story, and you don't have to explain all of the details because they went through it too, and it doesn't sound so weird. And being around normal people can be really hard because they talk about their frat party days and their proms and their high school experiences and their college experiences and their first loves and their first dates and their first kisses and their first everything. And you're just sitting there like, I was courted by somebody for 2 months. And like, what is that? Promise rings and all sorts of stuff that like just doesn't make sense in a normal society. And the stereotypes about females versus males and all of that, breaking those barriers in the corporate world and things like that. So it is hard to break out of it, but it's so rewarding too, because you actually get a life in the end of it with freedom, real freedom. I think this is so ironic about how they talked about how there's so much freedom in Christ and how you have so much freedom in the church, and how when you get saved, you should be like walking on air because you feel so free. And real freedom for me came when I broke down the barriers and kicked open the door and didn't look back and met people that weren't cult people and weren't church people, and then actually recognized my trauma for what it was, and then got healing through therapy, through my divorce, through a core group of people who have stood by me through everything. And it's good. It's good. So the healing will come. It's just, what is it, that quote that's like, all that's left is that good men do nothing. And I think that when you asked me to be on this podcast, Andrew, the reason I decided to do it was not because I'm some great eloquent speaker or because I feel like I have a really rare story to tell, but because nobody else was talking about it. This place is doing harm every day and no one is talking about it. And I felt like there was this responsibility to speak out. And I did not want to because it's uncomfortable to relive and it's uncomfortable to be a part of. And I just want other people to know it's okay to speak out, and it's okay if you're not ready yet either. But there is some healing in just putting it out into the universe and knowing that even if no one else ever speaks out against this place, somebody did. And that's all that really matters, is that some of their atrocities are made to light. Thank you.
Oh, of course. And just you are just an incredibly brave and strong person who has endured so much abuse, so much harm, and have just come out on the other side bright and shining and a light to other people. And I think you did a great job speaking through all of this. I had told you after our last interview, I'm like, oh my gosh, I just let you do your thing and you're ready for it. And yeah, and I think a lot of people will come forward because you took this step to talk about this place that people haven't talked about at all. So I commend you for that. It's not easy at all. But again, thank you for your bravery. And it's re-traumatizing at times, but also it can be healing. Oh my gosh. Wow. But thank you. Thank you so much for speaking out about the wilds.
I think you should get some credit too, if I'm allowed to put that little plug in here, because we wouldn't have a platform to speak about any of this if you hadn't taken the first step and gotten kicked out of Bob Jones and stood out for what Bob Jones was doing, and then creating a platform for survivors to come together and share about all the other harmful places that are connected with Bob Jones and the IFB movement. Shameless plug. that Andrew's the one that has set up all of this to make it happen and reached out and made a place for survivors to come speak freely without fear. And I think that's to be commended for, because you were the first. You were the pioneer that paved the way for all of us to be able to come forward and speak about our experiences. So you think I'm
Uh,
brave. I think you are very brave because I could not have been on the front lines at the beginning of this. And I think you've just made it really easy for me, and I'm sure all the other survivors, to come forward and start speaking.
thank you. That's so sweet to say that. But yeah, thank you to everyone listening. This is going to be several parts. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. My gosh. Yeah, so I thank you for everyone listening, and please share these episodes. This is important. Please share because this Tabitha's story needs to be heard and all the other things that happened. At the wilds. But yeah, thank you for listening. And this was Beyond BJU.